Tonight, we'll uncover some of the strangest and most disturbing secrets hidden within Red Dead Redemption 2. But before we begin, I discovered that 95% of you watching haven't subscribed to the channel. Please do. It really helps out and takes a lot of time to make these videos. Without further ado, let's begin. Red Dead Redemption 2 is not a game that hides its darkness. From the opening moments in the frozen mountains to Arthur Morgan's final breath, the game presents a world that's beautiful and brutal in equal measure, a world where violence is commonplace and morality is complicated, and where the American frontier of 1899 is dying in ways both literal and metaphorical. But beneath the main story of the Van der Linde gang's collapse, beneath the shootouts and train robberies and dramatic betrayals, there's a deeper layer of disturbing content that many players might miss on their first playthrough. This is the hidden darkness of Red Dead Redemption 2, the serial killers and cults and grotesque crimes that exist in the margins of the map, the environmental storytelling that reveals horrors the main missions only hint at, and the systemic cruelty of a society in transition where human life is cheap and suffering is constant. This is the complete disturbing lore of RDR2. Everything from the bodies you find in abandoned shacks to the nightmarish visions in the swamps, from the eugenics professors preaching racial hierarchies to the domestic abuse scenarios hidden in remote cabins, told comprehensively and factually based on what the game actually shows us. The world of 1899, a society built on violence. Understanding RDR2's disturbing elements requires understanding the historical context the game inhabits. The year is 1899, the very end of the 19th century, and America is transitioning from its frontier period into industrialized modernity. This transition is violent and chaotic, with entire ways of life being destroyed to make room for new economic systems and social orders. The game captures this moment with remarkable detail, showing a world where the old rules are breaking down, but the new rules haven't fully taken hold, creating a lawless space where terrible things happen with disturbing frequency. The map of RDR2 spans multiple states and territories, from the snowy mountains of Amberino to the swamps of Lemoyne to the deserts of New Austin. Each region has its own distinct culture and its own particular horrors. The game's world is populated by thousands of NPCs, each with routines and behaviours, and scattered throughout this world are environmental storytelling elements that reveal dark histories and ongoing crimes. These aren't quest markers or obvious story beats. They're things you discover by exploring, by investigating sounds or following trails, by being curious about why there's a cabin in a strange location, or what happened at an abandoned campsite. The game's commitment to period accuracy means it doesn't shy away from the ugliness of 1899 America. Racism is casual and constant, with black characters facing discrimination and violence throughout the game world. Native Americans are being systematically driven from their lands, their way of life being destroyed by government policies and corporate interests. Women have limited rights and opportunities, facing domestic violence and sexual exploitation with minimal legal recourse. The game doesn't endorse these attitudes. Arthur Morgan can and often does challenge racist or cruel NPCs, but it also doesn't pretend they didn't exist. This creates an uncomfortable playing experience at times, especially for modern audiences, but it's historically honest about what this era was like. The law enforcement in RDR2's world is brutal and corrupt. Lawmen will shoot suspects rather than arresting them. Private security forces like the Pinkertons operate with impunity, and justice is often delivered through lynching rather than trials. The game shows multiple hangings, some legal executions and some vigilante murders, and the player can intervene or participate or simply observe these moments of state-sanctioned violence. The casualness with which life is taken by authorities reinforces that this is a world where human life has minimal value, especially if you're poor or marginalised. The economic systems of the era create conditions for exploitation and suffering. Poor families live in shacks barely suitable for animals, while wealthy industrialists build mansions. Workers are injured or killed in industrial accidents with no compensation for their families. Debt leads to indentured servitude, with people trapped working for creditors who never consider the debt paid. The game shows these economic realities through environmental details and side activities, painting a picture of a society where prosperity for some requires grinding poverty for many others. Arthur Morgan's tuberculosis, the central horror. The most disturbing element of RDR2's story, and the one that affects the player most directly, is Arthur Morgan's diagnosis with tuberculosis and his subsequent slow death from the disease. This isn't a spoiler that can be avoided. It's central to understanding the game's thematic content and why so much of the story takes on the weight it does. Arthur contracts tuberculosis during a mission in Chapter 5 where he beats Thomas Downs, a debtor, and is coughed on directly in the face. Thomas Downs has tuberculosis, and this contact transmits the disease to Arthur. At first, Arthur's symptoms are minor. He coughs occasionally, dismisses it as nothing serious, but as the chapters progress, the coughing becomes more frequent and more violent. Arthur begins looking visibly ill, his face gaunt and pale, dark circles under his eyes. His stamina decreases, he becomes winded more easily, and the cough and fits interrupt conversations and missions. The player feels Arthur's deterioration directly through the gameplay, watching someone who was strong and capable become progressively weaker and more fragile. The diagnosis scene is devastating. Arthur visits a doctor in St. Denis after a particularly severe coughing fit, and the doctor examines him and delivers the news with clinical detachment. Arthur has tuberculosis, it's advanced, and he's going to die. There's no cure, not in 1899, and Arthur's lifestyle of sleeping outdoors, poor nutrition, and constant stress is accelerating the disease's progression. The doctor tells Arthur he has limited time and should settle his affairs. Arthur's reaction is quiet shock. He doesn't rage or break down. He simply absorbs the information and leaves, processing what he's just been told. From this point forward, every action Arthur takes is coloured by his mortality. He knows he's dying, and the player knows it too, and this creates a sense of tragic inevitability that hangs over the remaining chapters. Arthur's coughing becomes a constant reminder of his condition, interrupting moments that might otherwise be triumphant or peaceful. The game forces you to watch Arthur's decline in real time, to feel his weakness as your own capabilities diminish, to understand viscerally what it means to die slowly from disease. The choice to make Arthur's death from illness rather than from violence is significant. This is a game about outlaws and gunfights, and Arthur is one of the most dangerous gunslingers in the game world, but he doesn't die in a blaze of glory. He dies from a disease he caught from a poor farmer he was collecting a debt from, a random encounter that has catastrophic consequences. The mundanity of how Arthur contracts tuberculosis reinforces that in this era, disease was the most likely killer, not dramatic shootouts. The game makes you feel the injustice and senselessness of Arthur dying this way, strong and skilled but helpless against microscopic bacteria. Arthur's deterioration also affects how other characters interact with him. Some notice his condition and express concern, others seem oblivious or uncaring. Dutch, the gang's leader, dismisses Arthur's illness as weakness or an excuse, showing his deteriorating judgment and priorities. The divide between people who care about Arthur as a person and people who only value him for what he can do becomes clear through their reactions to his sickness. The final chapters of the game, played while Arthur is visibly dying, create gameplay and narrative experiences that are genuinely disturbing. You're watching a dead man walking, completing missions and trying to help people, while knowing Arthur won't live to see the outcomes of his actions. Every conversation where Arthur expresses hope for the future or makes plans is tragic because the player knows he won't be there. This foreknowledge of Arthur's death creates a unique kind of horror, not jump scares or gore, but the slow, inevitable approach of death that can't be fought or escaped. Thomas Downes and the Debt Collection. The moment that destroys everything. The Thomas Downes mission early in the game is one of RDR2's most important sequences, though players might not realise it on first playthrough. Strauss, the gang's loan shark, sends Arthur to collect a debt from Thomas Downes, a farmer who borrowed money and can't repay. Arthur finds Downes at a construction site and confronts him about the debt. Downes explains he doesn't have the money, he's sick and can't work and he needs more time. Arthur, following Strauss's instructions and his own nature as the gang's enforcer, doesn't accept these excuses. What follows is brutal. Arthur beats Thomas Downes, punching him repeatedly while Downes begs him to stop, explaining he has a family and he's sick and he'll get the money. Arthur doesn't care or doesn't let himself care. He continues the beating until Downes is on the ground. Then Downes coughs violently, blood coming from his mouth, and some of that blood hits Arthur's face. Arthur reacts with disgust, wiping the blood away, but he doesn't understand the significance of what just happened. Thomas Downes has tuberculosis, and Arthur has just been directly exposed to the disease. The scene is designed to make the player uncomfortable. You're controlling Arthur as he beats a sick man who clearly can't fight back, and who is desperately trying to explain his situation. The game doesn't give you an option to refuse or to be more gentle. You must complete the beating to progress the mission. This forces complicity, making the player participate in Arthur's cruelty, even if they morally oppose what's happening. The scene is shot to emphasize the power imbalance, Arthur standing over Downes, who's crumpled and bleeding, and the other workers at the construction site watching but not intervening because they're afraid of what Arthur might do to them. Later missions involve returning to the Downes family. Archie Downes, Thomas's son, confronts Arthur about his father's death and attacks him, blaming Arthur for killing his father. Mrs. Downes is destitute. She's lost the farm and turned to prostitution to survive, and when Arthur encounters her at a brothel, she's broken and bitter, telling Arthur that he destroyed her family over a small debt that meant nothing to the gang but everything to them. These encounters make clear the consequences of Arthur's actions. He didn't just beat Thomas Downes, he destroyed an entire family and caught the disease that will kill him. In later chapters, after his diagnosis, Arthur seeks out the Downes family to apologise and help them. He gives Mrs. Downes money and helps her son Archie escape to a safer situation. Arthur explicitly acknowledges that he's responsible for destroying their lives and that he can never truly make it right, but he tries anyway. These redemption missions are painful to play because Arthur is dying from the same disease that killed Thomas Downes, creating a direct karmic connection between Arthur's cruelty and his suffering. The Downs storyline represents Ardiatu's thesis about violence and consequences. Arthur has committed countless brutal acts throughout his life, but the Downs beating is the one that the game makes you experience fully and then forces you to confront the consequences of. The irony that Arthur catches tuberculosis from this one random debt collection, rather than from any of the more dramatic or significant crimes he commits, reinforces the game's themes about how violence and cruelty create ripples we can't predict or control. Arthur destroyed the Downs family for money that the gang probably spent within days, and that moment of casual violence resulted in Arthur's death and Mrs. Downs's destitution and Archie Downs's trauma. The serial killers, Edmund Lowry Jr. and his victims. One of Ardiatu's most disturbing side activities involves tracking a serial killer through the mutilated bodies he leaves scattered across the map. This isn't a mission that's given to you directly. Instead, it's discovered organically by stumbling across severed body parts in strange locations. The first body part is typically found near the railroad tracks south of Valentine, a torso without limbs or head, displayed in a grotesque pose. Examining the body reveals it's been mutilated post-mortem, and there's a map carved into the flesh showing locations. Following the map leads to more body parts scattered across the world, a severed head impaled on a pike, limbs arranged in deliberate patterns. Each discovery is more disturbing than the last, showing escalating brutality and clear evidence that this is someone who enjoys what they're doing. The bodies aren't just killed, they're displayed as art pieces, suggesting the killer has a message or an aesthetic they're pursuing. The locations are remote and carefully chosen, places where the bodies won't be discovered quickly, giving the killer time to complete his work. The investigation eventually leads to a basement in St. Denis, where the serial killer Edmund Lowry Jr. lives. The basement is a charnel house, full of body parts and torture instruments and evidence of numerous victims. There's a table set up like a dinner scene with corpses arranged as if they're eating together, a nightmarish tableau that shows the killer's disturbed psychology. Confronting Edmund reveals he's killed multiple people, dissected them, and kept parts as trophies or for his projects. He attacks Arthur with a knife, forcing a confrontation that ends with Edmund either dead or captured depending on player choices. What makes this storyline particularly disturbing is how it's presented as optional content that many players might never encounter. The game doesn't direct you to investigate the serial killer. You have to happen upon the first body and be curious enough to follow the clues. This means some players experience a version of RDR2 without this content, while others discover these horrific crime scenes and have to process them. The optional nature of the content doesn't make it less canonical. Edmund Lowry Jr. exists in the game world whether or not Arthur investigates him, meaning there's a serial killer operating throughout the time period of the game's story, killing and mutilating people while the main plot unfolds. The Edmund Lowry storyline also comments on urban anonymity and how criminals can operate undetected in cities. St. Denis is a large city by 1899 standards, and Edmund is able to abduct victims, bring them to his basement, murder and dismember them, and dispose of body parts across multiple states without being caught by authorities. This reflects historical reality about how serial killers could operate before modern forensic techniques and coordinated law enforcement. But it's still disturbing to realise that in RDR2's world, you can be kidnapped and murdered, and your body parts can be found months later without the killer facing any consequences unless a random outlaw happens to investigate. The Night Folk, swamp horror and ritualistic murder. The swamps of Lemoyne contain some of RDR2's most unsettling content in the form of the Night Folk, a cult or group that operates in the Bayou Enyor area near St. Denis. The Night Folk are first encountered through environmental horror. You're riding through the swamp at night and might see figures hanging from trees or hear strange sounds or find altars decorated with bones and skulls. These encounters are designed to be disorienting and frightening, using the limited visibility and atmospheric sounds of the swamp to create dread. The Night Folk themselves are terrifying. They're completely silent, never speaking or making sounds beyond footsteps and weapon noises. They attack suddenly and without warning, appearing from the water or dropping from trees or emerging from the fog. Their appearance is disturbing. Painted faces and wild hair and ragged clothing, looking more like creatures than humans. They use primitive weapons like machetes and poison arrows, and they're extremely aggressive, fighting to the death without attempting to flee or negotiate. The Night Folk set traps for travellers. One common encounter involves finding a woman on the road who appears injured and calls for help. If you approach to assist her, Night Folk ambush from the surrounding swamp, trying to kill Arthur and presumably loot his corpse. This trap is cruel in its exploitation of empathy, punishing players for trying to help someone in distress. The encounter teaches paranoia, making you suspicious of anyone you encounter in the swamp afterward, because they might be bait for another ambush. The altars and ritual sites scattered through the swamp suggest the Night Folk have beliefs or practices that involve death and sacrifice. Bodies are found arranged in specific patterns, surrounded by candles and symbols carved into trees. Some sites show evidence of torture or prolonged suffering before death. The Night Folk seem to either worship death or use it as a tool for some purpose the game never fully explains. This ambiguity is itself disturbing, not knowing whether these are religious rituals, psychological breaks, or something else entirely. One particularly disturbing encounter involves finding a shack in the swamp where Night Folk have apparently been living and conducting their activities. Inside are remains of victims, cages that might have held people before they were killed, and evidence that whatever happens here is prolonged and systematic rather than spontaneous violence. The implication that captives are kept alive for some period before being killed adds a layer of horror beyond quick deaths, suggesting torture or ritual requirements that extend suffering. The Night Folk are never fully explained by the game. You never learn who they are, where they came from, what their beliefs entail, or why they operate in the swamp. They're presented as a force of nature, a danger that exists in that environment the way alligators or disease exist, something to be aware of and feared but not necessarily understood. This lack of explanation makes them more frightening because there's no rational framework for comprehending their actions. They're just inhuman killers who hunt in the swamp. The Murfree Brood, inbred cannibals in the mountains. The Murfree Brood are one of RDR2's most overtly disturbing enemy factions, a group of inbred criminals operating in the mountains of Roanoke Ridge in New Hanover. Unlike other gangs in the game, who are at least somewhat organised and rational, the Murfree Brood are presented as degenerate and barely human, engaging in cannibalism, torture, and apparently recreational murder. Encounters with the Murfree Brood are designed to be shocking and repulsive, emphasising their otherness and monstrosity. The physical appearance of Murfree Brood members reinforces their presentation as subhuman. They're dirty and malformed, many showing signs of inbreeding like facial deformities and speech impediments. Their clothing is ragged and often decorated with bones or teeth, and their camps are filthy with garbage and remain scattered around. The game uses visual shorthand to communicate that these are people who've degenerated from civilization into something bestial, living in the mountains away from law and society. The Murfree Brood caves are some of the game's most disturbing locations. These cave systems serve as the gang's bases, and exploring them reveals horrors. Cages contain captives, both alive and dead, kept for unclear purposes. Bodies in various states of decomposition are piled or displayed. Evidence of cannibalism is present, with human remains apparently being consumed or stored for later consumption. Torture devices and blood-stained walls suggest prolonged violence rather than quick killings. The caves feel genuinely dangerous and wrong, places where terrible things happen regularly. One particularly disturbing element is the presence of captives who are still alive when Arthur discovers them. These people are trapped in cages, sometimes injured or traumatized, and they beg Arthur to free them. The player can rescue these captives, but the implication is clear. If Arthur hadn't happened upon this cave, these people would have been tortured, probably killed, possibly eaten by the Murfree Brood. The randomness of whether someone is rescued or becomes another victim adds to the horror. The Murfree Brood engage in ambush tactics throughout Roanoke Ridge, setting traps for travellers and attacking anyone who passes through their territory. These ambushes can be extremely violent, with Murfree members using explosives, fire, and crude weapons to attack victims. The frequency of these ambushes, combined with the finding of previous victims' remains in the area, suggests that many travellers have died in these mountains, their bodies joining the piles in Murfree caves. The game never fully explains what caused the Murfree Brood to become what they are. The name suggests a family line, implying generations of isolation and inbreeding in the mountains. The lack of apparent leadership structure or organisation suggests they're operating on instinct and tradition, rather than rational planning. They're presented as almost a natural hazard of the region, dangerous fauna rather than human criminals with understandable motivations. The choice to include an inbred cannibal gang in the game reflects both horror tropes and Appalachian stereotypes that are themselves problematic. The game uses class and geographic prejudices to create its villains, suggesting that poverty and isolation lead inevitably to degeneracy and violence. While the Murfree Brood are effective as horror antagonists, their presentation raises questions about what stereotypes the game is reinforcing, and whether this kind of dehumanization is appropriate even for fictional villains. The eugenics lecturer, academic racism and scientific bigotry, one of RDR2's most quietly disturbing encounters, involves a character identified as a eugenics lecturer who appears in St. Denis. This character stands on a corner delivering speeches about racial hierarchies and scientific racism, arguing that certain races are inherently superior and that society should prevent inferior races from reproducing. The lecturer presents these arguments as scientific fact, using the language and authority of academia to legitimize bigotry. The eugenics lecturer's presence in the game is historically accurate but deeply uncomfortable. Eugenics was a mainstream movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, taught at universities and supported by prominent scientists and politicians. The idea that racial characteristics were inheritable and that society could be improved through selective breeding was considered progressive and scientific by many educated people of the era. The game's inclusion of this character shows how scientific racism was normalized and presented as enlightenment rather than prejudice. The player can interact with the eugenics lecturer in various ways. Arthur can engage him in debate, can ignore him, or can respond with violence. If Arthur challenges the lecturer's claims, the lecturer becomes defensive and doubles down on his arguments, showing the closed-mindedness of ideological conviction. If Arthur doesn't intervene, the lecturer continues spreading his rhetoric to anyone who'll listen, and some NPCs in the crowd express agreement with his points. The disturbing element here is how the lecturer is presented as educated and respectable, rather than as an obvious villain. He's well-dressed, articulate, and presents his arguments in academic language with citations to authorities and studies. To people in 1899 who haven't learned the historical consequences of eugenics ideology, he sounds legitimate and scientific. The game trusts players to recognise the horror of what's being advocated even when it's wrapped in scholarly presentation. Arthur's personal reactions to the eugenics lecturer, available through dialogue choices and journal entries, show his discomfort with this kind of systematic racism. Arthur is casually racist in ways typical of his era and background, but the lecturer's ideological and systematic approach to bigotry seems to disturb him. Arthur recognises that what's being proposed is monstrous even if he doesn't have the language to articulate exactly why reducing humans to breeding stock based on racial characteristics is fundamentally evil. The inclusion of the eugenics lecturer serves multiple purposes. It's historically authentic, showing ideologies that were genuinely popular in this era. It comments on how atrocities are often justified through scientific or academic language rather than through obvious evil, and it challenges players to confront that the racism they might dismiss as just period-typical casual prejudice was part of larger ideological systems that led to genocides and forced sterilizations and horrific human rights abuses in the 20th century. Domestic violence and abuse. The Catfish Jacksons Homestead. The Catfish Jacksons Homestead is a small location in Lemoyne that contains one of RDR2's darkest environmental storytelling sequences. The first time Arthur visits this homestead, he might encounter a man named Nate, who's clearly been in a fight, bruised and holding his face. If Arthur talks to Nate, he'll make excuses about his injuries and be defensive, trying to get Arthur to leave. Inside the house, Arthur can find Nate's mother, an elderly woman who seems afraid and won't speak freely about what's happening in her home. Investigating further reveals that Nate is an abusive son who's been stealing from his elderly mother and beating her when she protests or when he's drunk. The mother is trapped in her own home, afraid of her son but unable or unwilling to leave or report him to authorities. The abuse is implied to be ongoing and escalating, with the mother's fear suggesting this isn't the first or even worst incident. Arthur can confront Nate about the abuse, which leads to Nate becoming aggressive and defensive, making excuses or blaming his mother or telling Arthur to mind his own business. If Arthur persists, Nate will attack, forcing a physical confrontation. Alternatively, Arthur can report the situation to law enforcement, though the game suggests that legal intervention in domestic situations is rare and often ineffective in this era. What makes this scenario particularly disturbing is how realistically it portrays domestic abuse dynamics. The mother makes excuses for her son, doesn't want to press charges or even admit what's happening, and seems more afraid of the consequences of intervention than of continued abuse. Nate shows classic abuser behaviours, minimising his actions, blaming the victim, and responding to confrontation with violence. The situation feels trapped and hopeless, with no clear solution that will definitively protect the mother. If Arthur intervenes violently and kills or severely injures Nate, he technically saves the mother from future abuse, but the game suggests this creates other problems for her. She's now alone without the son who, despite abusing her, was also handling certain aspects of maintaining the homestead. The mother might be safer, but she's also more vulnerable to other threats and to poverty. This moral complication reflects reality about domestic abuse, that leaving or stopping the abuser often creates new dangers and hardships for victims. The Catfish Jackson scenario is one of several domestic abuse situations scattered throughout RDR2's world. Other homesteads and encounters show husbands abusing wives, parents abusing children, and the general acceptance of family violence as a private matter beyond law enforcement's purview. These scenarios are never presented as acceptable. Arthur consistently disapproves and can intervene, but they're shown as common enough to be unremarkable to the NPCs who live in this world. The Braithwaite Manor burning, family dysfunction, and its consequences. The Braithwaite family mission arc in Chapter 3 culminates in one of RDR2's most visually dramatic and morally disturbing sequences. The Braithwaites are an old aristocratic southern family whose wealth and power have been declining for generations, leaving them bitter and desperate. Catherine Braithwaite, the family matriarch, runs the household with an iron fist, and the family's involved in various criminal enterprises including moonshining and eventually the kidnapping of Jack Marston, Dutch's surrogate nephew. When the Van der Linde gang discovers the Braithwaites have taken Jack, Dutch leads an assault on Braithwaite Manor. What follows is a massacre. The gang shoots their way through dozens of Braithwaite men, killing anyone who resists. The mission is designed to make the player feel righteous anger. These people took a child and the gang is getting him back through overwhelming violence. But the scale of the killing is disturbing. Bodies pile up on the manor grounds, and many of the dead are likely servants or distant relatives who had nothing to do with Jack's kidnapping. The climax involves confronting Catherine Braithwaite herself. Dutch demands to know where Jack is, and Catherine, broken and defiant, reveals she sold Jack to a crime boss named Angelo Bronte. Catherine knows she's about to die, and she taunts the gang, telling them they'll never find Jack, that they're all doomed, that their way of life is ending. Dutch orders the gang to burn the manor, and they douse the building in kerosene and set it ablaze. Catherine Braithwaite remains inside, choosing to die in the fire with her home rather than fleeing or surrendering. The image of Catherine Braithwaite burning alive in the manor is horrific. You can hear her screaming as the building burns, and the gang stands outside watching the structure collapse, satisfied that they've delivered justice for Jack's kidnapping. But the scene is disturbing because it shows how revenge and righteous anger can lead to atrocity. The gang has just massacred an entire household and burned an elderly woman alive, and they're portrayed as heroic for doing it because their cause was just. The Braithwaite family's dysfunction is revealed through environmental details and NPC dialogue before the final confrontation. The family is inbred, with genetic problems from generations of cousins marrying cousins to preserve wealth and bloodlines. Several Braithwaite men are shown to be intellectually disabled or mentally ill, kept locked in outbuildings or hidden away from public view. The family's obsession with maintaining their aristocratic status despite their declining fortunes has led them to make increasingly destructive decisions, culminating in kidnapping a child in a desperate attempt to gain leverage over the Van der Linde gang. After the manor burns, you can return to the ruins and explore what remains. Bodies are scattered around the property, and the charred remains of the manor stand as a monument to the violence that occurred. The game doesn't let you forget what happened here. The destruction is permanent and visible for the rest of the game. This is one of several locations where the gang's actions leave permanent scars on the landscape, showing that violence has lasting consequences that can't be undone. The Colonian cult, suicide and religious fanaticism. The Colonians are a cult in RDR2 devoted to worshipping turtles and believing that humanity is doomed, that the world is ending, and that only through embracing Colonian philosophy can anyone find peace. The cult is obviously absurd, with members wearing turtle shells and speaking in pseudo-religious language about the wisdom of turtles and the folly of human civilization. But beneath the absurdity is something genuinely dark. This is a suicide cult, and multiple encounters with Colonians involve them attempting to kill themselves or each other. The first Colonian encounter typically occurs near Lakay in the bayou, where Arthur finds cult members preparing for a mass suicide. They've gathered on a cliff overlooking water, and they're planning to jump to their deaths together, believing this will allow them to transcend their human forms and join the turtles in eternal peace. Arthur can talk to the cult leader, who explains their philosophy and their certainty that death is preferable to continued existence in a corrupt world. If Arthur doesn't intervene, the cultists jump to their deaths, multiple people drowning or dying from impact. Subsequent Colonian encounters show the cult's continued death obsession. You might find individual members attempting suicide by various methods, always with the justification that death is release and that human existence is suffering. The cult actively recruits, trying to convince others to join them in embracing death and turtle wisdom. Their presence in the game is darkly comic at first. The turtle worship seems ridiculous, but watching people actually die for these beliefs removes the humour and leaves only tragedy. The Chelonian cult represents how desperate people can be exploited by charismatic leaders offering simple answers to complex problems. The cult members are often poor or marginalised, people struggling with the harsh realities of 1899 America, who find comfort in a belief system that says their suffering is temporary and death is escape. The cult leader is either a true believer or a manipulator. It's unclear which, but either way they're facilitating multiple deaths in service of an ideology that offers nothing but extinction. Arthur's reactions to the Chelonians in his journal show his contempt for their philosophy, but also his recognition that these are people in pain seeking relief. He doesn't mock the cult members themselves. He mocks the belief system that's convinced them death is preferable to life. Arthur, dying from tuberculosis and increasingly aware of his own mortality, has complicated feelings about a group that's chosen death when he's having it forced upon him by disease. The Pig Farmer, Aberdeen Pig Farm horror. The Aberdeen Pig Farm is one of RDR2's most disturbing side locations, a horror scenario that plays out like something from a slasher film. The farm is run by two siblings, Bray and Tammy Aberdeen, who seem friendly and welcoming when Arthur first arrives. They invite him in for dinner, offer him food and drink, and seem like eccentric but harmless country folk. But as the evening progresses, details emerge that suggest something is very wrong. The Aberdeen siblings are in an incestuous relationship, which they discuss matter-of-factly as if it's completely normal. Their conversation becomes increasingly unsettling, with references to their mother's death and hints about previous visitors who aren't around anymore. The house is decorated with disturbing paintings and artifacts, and there's an atmosphere of wrongness that builds throughout the encounter. If Arthur drinks the liquid the Aberdeens offer, he passes out from being drugged. Arthur wakes up in a mass grave behind the farm, apparently left for dead after being robbed. Climbing out of the grave reveals skeletal remains of previous victims, people who were drugged, robbed, and dumped in this hole to die, or who were already dead when disposed of. The Aberdeens are serial killers who lure travellers to their farm, drug them, steal their money, and dispose of the bodies. The casual friendliness was always a trap, and Arthur nearly became another victim. Confronting the Aberdeens after escaping the grave reveals they're unapologetic and hostile, treating their murders as a business and mocking Arthur for falling for their trick. The player can kill them, rob them, or simply leave after retrieving Arthur's stolen money. The farm remains accessible after this encounter, a dark location full of evidence of past crimes, and players have reported finding additional disturbing details when exploring more thoroughly. What makes the Aberdeen Pig Farm particularly disturbing is how it subverts the southern hospitality trope. The Aberdeens present as welcoming hosts, offering food and shelter, and this friendliness makes their betrayal and violence more shocking. The incestuous relationship between siblings adds another layer of transgression, marking them as outside normal social boundaries in multiple ways. And the mass grave full of previous victims shows this isn't an isolated incident. They've been doing this for some time, killing numerous people without facing consequences. The Aberdeen encounter is optional content many players might miss, but for those who experience it, it's one of the game's most memorable horror moments. It transforms a seemingly innocent homestead visit into a nightmare, and it reinforces the game's theme that danger in the frontier comes from many sources, not just obvious outlaws or wild animals, but from people who seem civilized and welcoming until they have you at their mercy. Pleasance, the Ghost Town Massacre. Pleasance is a small abandoned town in Lemoyne that appears on the map but has no living inhabitants. Exploring the town reveals it's not just abandoned, it's a massacre site. Buildings are burned and destroyed, skeletons are scattered throughout the area, and environmental clues tell the story of what happened here. A sign at the town's entrance has been defaced with red paint reading "Stay Out Plague," suggesting disease was involved in the town's demise. Investigating more thoroughly reveals inconsistencies with the plague explanation. Many of the skeletons show evidence of violence, bullet holes in skulls or bones, broken in ways suggesting combat or execution. The burn patterns on buildings suggest deliberate arson rather than accidental fire. The scattered belongings and the positions of some bodies suggest people were trying to flee when they died. All of this points to something more sinister than disease-killing Pleasance's residents. The most likely explanation, pieced together from environmental clues and NPC dialogue, is that Pleasance was destroyed by a lynch mob or vigilante group, possibly related to racial violence or religious persecution. The plague warning might have been an excuse used to justify the massacre, claiming the town was diseased and had to be purged, when in reality it was ethnic cleansing or punishment for some real or perceived transgression. The complete destruction of the town and the killing of all inhabitants shows the capacity for collective violence in frontier communities. One particularly disturbing detail in Pleasance is a mass grave near the church containing multiple skeletons. suggesting these people were executed and buried together. The positioning of the bodies implies they were forced into the grave before or after being killed, that this was an organised mass killing rather than chaotic violence. The presence of children's skeletons among the dead reinforces that this was indiscriminate slaughter, killing everyone regardless of age or complicity in whatever offence the town supposedly committed. Arthur's journal entries about Pleasance express horror and confusion about what happened. He recognises this wasn't disease or accident but deliberate massacre, and he struggles to understand what could motivate people to destroy an entire town. The entry reflects Arthur's growing disillusionment with civilization and human nature as the game progresses, seeing that the violence he and his gang commit is mirrored in supposedly respectable society's capacity for atrocity. Pleasance remains accessible throughout the game as a ghost town, a permanent reminder of past violence. Unlike locations where the gang commits violence that affects the present, Pleasance is frozen in the past, a historical atrocity that Arthur discovers rather than participates in. This creates a different kind of horror, not guilt over your actions, but the disturbing realization that terrible things happened here before you arrived, and will remain long after you leave. The Blackwater Massacre, the gang's original sin. Though it occurs before the game begins and is never shown directly, the Blackwater Massacre is one of RDR2's most important disturbing events, because it sets up the gang's entire trajectory toward dissolution. The massacre is referenced constantly throughout the game, discussed in hushed tones or in arguments, and it's clear that something went catastrophically wrong during this ferry heist that changed the gang forever. From pieced together dialogue and Arthur's journal entries, the Blackwater job was supposed to be a simple ferry robbery, stealing money and getting out clean. But the job went wrong immediately. Shooting started, civilians and lawmen were killed, and the gang's escape was chaotic and desperate. Dutch personally killed a young woman named Heidi McCourt, shooting her in cold blood for reasons that are never fully explained. McCallender and Davy Callender, gang members, were killed during the massacre or in the immediate aftermath. Jenny Kirk, another gang member, was also killed. John Marston was severely injured and nearly died. The gang escaped Blackwater with Pinkertons and lawmen pursuing them, forced to flee into the mountains where the game begins. They left behind the money they'd stolen, a significant amount that they spent the rest of the game hoping to retrieve. More importantly, they left behind their reputation as successful outlaws who were careful and controlled. After Blackwater, the Van der Linde gang is marked as a serious threat, with significant law enforcement resources dedicated to hunting them down. What makes the Blackwater Massacre disturbing is how it's discussed by gang members. Some, like Arthur, are horrified by what happened and how unnecessary the violence was. Others, like Micah, see it as just another job that happened to go wrong. Dutch's behaviour regarding Blackwater is particularly concerning. He becomes defensive and angry when questioned about it, refusing to fully explain what happened or why he killed Heidi McCourt. This defensiveness suggests Dutch knows he made catastrophic errors, but can't admit them. The revelation that Dutch killed a young woman in cold blood during the massacre is a turning point in how players view his character. Throughout the early game, Dutch is presented as charismatic and principled, someone who kills only when necessary and who has moral boundaries. But Heidi McCourt's death, described by witnesses as an execution of someone who wasn't a threat, shows Dutch is capable of murdering innocents when he's under pressure or losing control. This foreshadows his later descent into increasing violence and paranoia. The Blackwater Massacre also represents the end of the gang's golden age, the moment when everything started falling apart. In conversations throughout the game, characters remember times before Blackwater when the gang was successful and happy, when they had enough money and minimal law enforcement pressure. Blackwater marks the transition from a functioning criminal enterprise to a desperate group of fugitives running from place to place, always one step ahead of capture or death. Micah Bell, the embodiment of casual evil. While RDR2 has many disturbing characters and situations, Micah Bell stands out as perhaps the most consistently revolting presence in the game. Micah is a member of the Van der Linde gang, and from his introduction he's presented as cruel, racist, misogynistic, and sadistic. Unlike Arthur, who struggles with his violent nature and tries to do some good, or Dutch, who at least pretends to have principles, Micah seems to genuinely enjoy causing suffering and has no moral boundaries whatsoever. Micah's casual racism is constant and deliberate. He uses slurs freely, targets non-white gang members with particular hostility, and expresses white supremacist views openly. His treatment of women is degrading and threatening, with implications that he's committed sexual violence in the past and would do so again if given opportunity. His interactions with other gang members are calculated to cause division and hurt, deliberately undermining relationships and sowing discord. The Strawberry Jail mission reveals Micah's capacity for violence that serves no purpose beyond satisfying his bloodlust. After Arthur breaks Micah out of jail, Micah insists on retrieving his guns from the sheriff's office, even though this is unnecessary and risks drawing attention. Once inside, Micah kills multiple lawmen despite Arthur's protest that they should leave quietly. The mission devolves into a town-wide shootout that gets numerous people killed, all because Micah wanted his specific guns and enjoyed the opportunity for violence. Micah's time in Guarma, the tropical island where the gang is temporarily stranded, shows him attempting to position himself as Dutch's most loyal follower while undermining Arthur at every opportunity. Micah recognizes that Dutch is becoming unstable and paranoid, and rather than trying to help Dutch recover or protect the gang, Micah exploits Dutch's deteriorating mental state to increase his own influence. He feeds Dutch's paranoia, confirms his suspicions about loyalty, and encourages his worst impulses toward violence and revenge. The revelation that Micah is a Pinkerton informant, feeding information to the law about the gang's activities, recontextualizes all his actions throughout the game. Micah wasn't just a terrible person who happened to be in the gang. He was actively working to destroy the gang from within, while profiting from betraying his supposed brothers. Every job that went wrong, every time the law showed up when they shouldn't have known where the gang was, Micah was likely responsible. What makes Micah particularly disturbing is how realistically he's written as a certain type of predatory person who gravitates toward groups and institutions where violence is normalized. Micah is the gang member who enjoys killing, who sees opportunities for cruelty where others see problems to solve. He's manipulative enough to maintain his position despite others disliking him, always making himself useful to leadership while being vicious to those without power to retaliate. Micah represents how toxic individuals can corrupt organizations from within, while hiding behind group loyalty and shared purpose. The Veteran and His Wolves. Slow death from war injuries. Hamish Sinclair is a veteran living alone in a cabin in the mountains with his prosthetic leg, an injury from his time in the military. Arthur can encounter Hamish through a series of side missions that build a genuine friendship between the two men. Hamish teaches Arthur to hunt and fish, and they share stories about their lives and regrets. This friendship is one of Arthur's few genuinely positive relationships, a connection with someone who accepts him without judgment and who shares his love of the natural world. The final mission with Hamish involves hunting a massive boar that's been terrorising the area. During the hunt, the boar attacks and gores Hamish, injuring him fatally. Arthur tries to help, but Hamish is bleeding out, and he dies in Arthur's arms, asking Arthur to care for his horse Buell and to remember their friendship. Hamish's death is sudden and tragic, a good person dying in a random animal attack after surviving war and adapting to disability. What makes this scenario disturbing isn't gore or violence, but the senselessness of it. Hamish survived whatever military conflict cost him his leg, survived decades of frontier living with a disability, maintained his independence and dignity, and built a life he seemed content with. Then he's killed by an animal in what should have been a routine hunt, dying alone in the woods with only Arthur present. The randomness of this death, happening to someone who didn't deserve it, reflects the game's broader themes about mortality and fate. Arthur's journal entries about Hamish show how much this friendship meant to him and how much Hamish's death affects him. For Arthur, who's dying from tuberculosis and increasingly isolated as the gang falls apart, Hamish represented proof that a good life was possible, even after violence and loss. Hamish had been a soldier, had killed people and been injured, but he'd found peace in solitude and nature. Arthur hoped he might find something similar, but Hamish's death suggests that peace might not be possible, that violence and death are inescapable. If players complete this mission after Arthur's diagnosis, there's added poignancy because Arthur is watching someone else die suddenly, while he himself is dying slowly. The contrast between Hamish's quick death from the boar attack and Arthur's prolonged decline from tuberculosis highlights different types of mortality. Hamish's death is painful but mercifully fast, while Arthur's is drawn out and degrading, slowly robbing him of strength and vitality before finally killing him. The gang's moral decline, Guarma and beyond. Chapter 5 takes the gang to Guarma, a fictional Caribbean island embroiled in revolution, and this sequence represents the most concentrated period of morally questionable violence in the game. The gang is shipwrecked on Guarma after a failed bank robbery in St. Denis, and they immediately become involved in the island's civil war, helping rebel forces fight against government troops and their sugar plantation oligarch supporters. The Guarma chapters are relentlessly violent, with massive battles involving hundreds of combatants and civilian casualties, mounting in ways the game doesn't fully address. The gang helps the rebels storm a plantation where enslaved workers are being held, liberating them but killing dozens of guards and officials in the process. They execute captured enemy officers, blow up ships and buildings, and generally wreak havoc across the island. The game frames this violence as justified because the plantation system is evil and the rebels are fighting for freedom, but the scale of killing and destruction is disturbing regardless of justification. Dutch's behaviour on Guarma shows his deteriorating judgment and increasing willingness to use extreme violence. During one mission, Dutch strangles Gloria, an elderly woman who was helping the gang but who Dutch suspects of betraying them. Arthur witnesses this murder and is horrified, recognising that Dutch has crossed a line by killing an old woman with his bare hands, based on suspicion rather than proof. This moment is pivotal in Arthur's loss of faith in Dutch's leadership and moral authority. The return from Guarma marks the beginning of the gang's final collapse. They've lost members, they're more desperate than ever, and Dutch is increasingly unstable and paranoid. The missions following Guarma involve escalating violence and increasingly foolish plans, with Dutch making decisions that clearly endanger the gang while refusing to listen to anyone who questions him. The gang members start openly arguing, with factions forming around different leaders and different visions for what should happen next. Arthur's perspective on the gang's moral decline is chronicled in his journal, where he expresses growing horror at what the gang is becoming and what he himself has done. Arthur begins questioning whether the gang's espoused values about loyalty and freedom were ever real, or whether they were always just justifications for selfishness and violence. He wonders if Dutch changed, or if Dutch was always capable of this kind of cruelty, and he just didn't see it before. The fate of the Native American characters. RDR2's portrayal of Native American characters and the ongoing genocide against indigenous peoples is one of its most disturbing thematic elements. The game is set during a period when the US government's policy of forced relocation and cultural destruction of Native Americans was reaching its final stages, and the game doesn't shy away from showing this historical reality. Rainsfall and his son Eagle Flies are the primary Native American characters in the main story. Rainsfall is a chief advocating for peace and accommodation with the US government, hoping to preserve his people through negotiation and compromise. Eagle Flies is a young warrior who wants to fight back against the theft of their lands and the destruction of their way of life. The conflict between father and son represents the impossible choice facing Native Americans in this era: submit to cultural genocide peacefully, or fight back and face military extermination. The missions involving Rainsfall and Eagle Flies show the US Army and private corporations systematically destroying Native American communities. Oil companies are drilling on sacred lands without permission. The army is forcibly relocating tribes from their traditional territories, and violence is used freely against anyone who resists. The game shows Native American children being taken to boarding schools designed to erase their culture and language, soldiers destroying villages and food supplies to starve tribes into submission, and the general contempt that white settlers and authorities have for indigenous peoples. Eagle Flies' storyline culminates in a raid on an oil refinery that goes catastrophically wrong. Eagle Flies is killed by the army, dying for his resistance but accomplishing nothing that helps his people. His death devastates Rainsfall and reinforces the tragedy of the situation. Fighting back results in death, but submission results in cultural destruction. There's no good option. Both paths lead to the elimination of Native American independence and identity. Arthur's journal entries about the Native American characters show his growing awareness of the injustice being committed against them. Arthur recognizes that what's happening to Rainsfall's people is wrong, that the theft of their lands and forced relocation is evil, but he feels powerless to stop it because it's being done by governments and armies, rather than by individuals he could fight. This powerlessness in the face of systematic oppression is itself disturbing, showing how massive injustices can occur while individuals who oppose them feel unable to effectively intervene. The game's decision to include this content is brave from a storytelling perspective, but also potentially exploitative. Depicting genocide is important for historical accuracy and for understanding the era, but there's always a risk that showing suffering becomes entertainment, that Native American tragedy becomes just another element of the game's dark atmosphere rather than being treated with appropriate gravity. The game tries to balance this by making Rainsfall and Eaglefly's fully developed characters rather than props. But the question remains whether depicting genocide in an entertainment product can ever be fully appropriate. The Braithwaite gold and slavery's lingering presence. Catherine Braithwaite's family wealth was built on slavery, and the game includes details about how the Braithwaite fortune was made and lost through the plantation system and the Civil War's aftermath. Environmental storytelling at the manor and in conversations reveals that the Braithwaites owned enslaved people before the Civil War, profited from their labour, and lost their primary source of wealth when slavery ended. The Braithwaite gold mission involves Arthur and a treasure hunter named Sean breaking into the manor to steal gold that Catherine has supposedly hidden somewhere on the property. The mission reveals that the gold was acquired through slavery and through selling enslaved people during the Civil War, making it blood money in the most literal sense. The descendants of enslaved people are still living in the area, working as tenant farmers or servants, trapped in economic systems that perpetuate their exploitation even though legal slavery has ended. Arthur's reactions to learning about the Braithwaite's slave trading past show his moral complexity. He's disgusted by slavery and recognizes it as evil, but he's also willing to steal the gold that was made from slavery without much hesitation. This inconsistency reflects Arthur's broader character. He has moral principles, but they're situational and often compromised by his need for money or loyalty to the gang. The game includes environmental details showing the continuing effects of slavery on the region. Shackles and chains can be found at old plantation sites. Buildings that housed enslaved people are still standing in various states of decay, and the economic and social hierarchies of the slavery era persist, even though the legal institution has ended. Black characters in the game face constant discrimination and violence, showing that while slavery ended, the racial hierarchies it created were maintained through other means. One particularly disturbing location is Shady Bell, the plantation house the gang uses as a hideout in Chapter 4. The building was clearly a plantation house with enslaved labour quarters nearby, and using it as a base creates uncomfortable juxtaposition between the gang's claims to fight against civilization's injustices, while literally occupying a symbol of one of history's greatest injustices. The game doesn't explicitly address this irony, leaving it to players to recognize the dissonance. The decline of Arthur Morgan, physical and moral deterioration. Arthur's physical decline from tuberculosis is paralleled by questions about his moral state and whether he's becoming better or worse as a person as he approaches death. The game's honour system allows players to shape Arthur's character, making choices that push him toward redemption or toward continued cruelty. But regardless of player choices, Arthur's awareness of his mortality forces him to confront what kind of person he's been and what he wants to be in his remaining time. High Honour Arthur shows signs of genuine moral growth, helping people without expectation of reward, trying to undo some of the harm he's caused, and actively working to save other gang members from Dutch's increasingly destructive leadership. His journal entries become more introspective and philosophical, questioning the life he's lived and wondering if anything he's done mattered. This Arthur dies seeking redemption, trying to be good even though he knows it can't erase his past violence. Low Honour Arthur becomes more nihilistic and cruel as his death approaches, embracing the violence that's defined his life and rejecting the possibility of redemption. This Arthur continues robbing and killing without remorse, his journal entries becoming bitter and fatalistic, accepting that he's a bad person who's going to die badly. This version of Arthur's decline is disturbing because it shows someone giving up on themselves, deciding that if they're damned anyway, they might as well embrace it fully. Regardless of honour level, Arthur's physical deterioration is constant and horrifying to watch. His face becomes gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow, his movements slower and less certain. The coughing fits interrupt increasingly important moments, undermining his attempts to speak or act. Other characters react to Arthur's appearance with concern or disgust or pity, and Arthur himself comments in his journal about how he can see death in the mirror, how he's becoming a corpse before he's actually dead. The game forces players to feel Arthur's weakness through gameplay changes. His stamina decreases, making it harder to run or fight for extended periods. His health core degrades faster and regenerates slower, meaning Arthur is more vulnerable to damage and takes longer to recover. These mechanical changes make you feel Arthur's declining health directly, struggling to complete activities that were easy in early chapters because Arthur's body is failing him. Arthur's decline also affects how he interacts with the world. His dialogue becomes more fatalistic, his reactions to violence more weary, his engagement with the gang's plans more skeptical. He starts saying goodbye to people without explicitly stating it, having final conversations with gang members where he tells them things he wants them to know before he dies. These interactions are heavy with the knowledge that this might be the last time Arthur speaks to this person, creating a sense of profound sadness. The death of Lenny Summers, the loss of innocence. Lenny Summers is one of the youngest members of the Van der Linde gang, a teenager who's intelligent, idealistic and genuinely good-hearted despite being an outlaw. Lenny joined the gang after killing men who murdered his father, seeking revenge but also seeking a family to replace what he had lost. Throughout the game, Lenny represents the gang's potential for good, someone young enough that he might escape the outlaw life and build something better. Lenny's death during the St. Denis bank robbery is sudden and shocking. The gang is escaping through the city after the robbery went wrong, fighting through police and Pinkerton agents, and during the running gunfight, Lenny is shot and killed instantly. There's no dramatic final words or meaningful death scene. Lenny is just suddenly dead, falling from a rooftop and being left behind as the gang continues running. The casualness of his death, happening in the chaos of the escape with barely any acknowledgement in the moment, makes it more disturbing than a dramatic death scene would. B. Arthur's reaction to Lenny's death shows how much he cared about the younger man, and how guilty he feels about bringing Lenny into situations that got him killed. In journal entries and conversations after the robbery, Arthur expresses regret that Lenny never got a chance to use his intelligence for something legitimate, that his potential was wasted in service of the gang's doomed efforts. Arthur recognizes that Lenny's death is particularly tragic because Lenny was good and could have been better if he'd had different opportunities. Lenny's death also represents the gang's loss of its future. The older gang members like Arthur, Dutch and Hosea had lived their lives and made their choices, but Lenny was young enough that he might have escaped the outlaw life and built something new. His death removes that possibility, ensuring that the Van der Linde gang won't have any legacy beyond violence and dissolution. The young people who might have learned from the old gang's mistakes and done better are being killed before they have that chance. The St. Denis bank robbery mission where Lenny dies is one of the game's most intense and tragic sequences. Multiple gang members die, the gang is scattered, and the survivors are forced to flee the country. The mission marks the point of no return for the gang. After this, they'll never recover or rebuild. They're in terminal decline. Lenny's death as part of this catastrophe shows how quickly things can collapse, how a single failed job can destroy everything a group has built. Hosea Matthews' death, the loss of wisdom. Hosea Matthews is the oldest member of the Vanderlinde gang and serves as its conscience and voice of reason. Hosea is Dutch's oldest friend, having been with him since before the gang formed, and throughout the game Hosea tries to temper Dutch's worst impulses and guide the gang towards safer and more sustainable choices. Hosea's presence is stabilizing. He's the person other gang members go to for advice, and his wisdom and experience have kept the gang alive through previous crises. Hosea's death during the St. Denis bank robbery is a turning point for the entire gang. During the robbery, Hosea is taken hostage by the Pinkertons along with Abigail. When the gang tries to negotiate for their release, Pinkerton agent Milton shoots Hosea in the chest, killing him instantly in front of the entire gang. Milton justifies this murder by saying Hosea was a criminal, and lawmen don't need to honour agreements with outlaws, showing the Pinkertons' contempt for any rules or ethics. The impact of Hosea's death on Dutch is immediate and catastrophic. Dutch loses the one person who could moderate his paranoia and grandiosity, the friend who could tell him when his plans were stupid or dangerous without Dutch taking it as betrayal. After Hosea's death, Dutch becomes increasingly irrational and violent, making decisions that endanger the gang and refusing to listen to anyone who questions him. Hosea's moderating influence is gone, and Dutch's worst traits are unleashed without check. Arthur's grief over Hosea's death is profound. Hosea was a mentor and father figure to Arthur, teaching him to read and to think beyond simple violence, showing him that outlaws could have principles and intelligence. Arthur's journal entries after Hosea's death express despair about the gang's future, and recognition that without Hosea's wisdom, the gang is doomed. Arthur knows that he can't replace Hosea's role, that Dutch won't listen to him the way Dutch listened to Hosea, and that the gang is going to make catastrophic mistakes without Hosea's guidance. The St. Denis bank robbery was supposed to be the gang's final score, the job that would give them enough money to disappear and start new lives. Instead, it's the disaster that destroys the gang, killing multiple members including the two most stabilizing influences, Lenny and Hosea, and forcing the survivors to flee to Guarma where things only get worse. The robbery represents the gang's fatal overconfidence, their belief that they could pull off one more big score despite mounting evidence that their luck was running out. The torture of Colm O'Driscoll's men and the cycle of revenge. The rivalry between the Vanderlinde gang and the O'Driscoll gang is based on a cycle of revenge that's been going on for years before the game begins. Colm O'Driscoll killed Dutch's lover Annabelle years ago, and Dutch has been seeking revenge ever since. The O'Driscolls and Vanderlinde gang attack each other whenever they meet, with both sides escalating violence in response to previous violence, creating a blood feud where the original cause is less important than the accumulated grievances. One mission involves rescuing Kieran Duffy, a former O'Driscoll who's joined the Vanderlinde gang after he's been captured and tortured by his former associates. The rescue mission shows how viciously both gangs treat captured enemies, with the O'Driscolls having tortured Kieran for information about the Vanderlinde gang's location and plans. The game doesn't show the torture explicitly, but the aftermath is clear. Kieran is injured and traumatized, and his eventual death at O'Driscoll's hands is brutal. Kieran's death is shown in one of the game's most horrific sequences. During a party at the gang's camp, Kieran's body is brought in on horseback, dead and decapitated. His severed head has been gouged out where his eyes once were, a final act of brutality from the O'Driscolls. The gang members are shocked and horrified, and this moment marks another escalation in the violence between the two groups. The cycle of revenge continues, each side justifying their cruelty by pointing to the other's atrocities. Conclusion: finding meaning in the darkness. Red Dead Redemption 2 doesn't offer easy answers or comfortable resolutions to the darkness it portrays. The game's world is brutal and unforgiving, filled with violence, disease, prejudice, and suffering. But within this darkness, the game also explores themes of redemption, loyalty, and the possibility of change even when death is inevitable. Arthur Morgan's journey from enforcer to someone seeking redemption shows that even people who've committed terrible acts can recognize their mistakes and try to do better. His efforts to help the Downs family, to save other gang members from Dutch's destructive leadership, and to ensure that John Marston and his family escape to build a better life, demonstrate that meaningful action is possible even in the face of mortality. The game suggests that while we can't escape the consequences of our past actions, we can choose how we face our remaining time. Arthur's tuberculosis diagnosis forces him to confront his mortality and decide what kind of person he wants to be in his final days. Whether players guide him toward high honor redemption or low honor nihilism, the game acknowledges that these choices matter, that how we treat others and what we stand for defines us more than how long we live. Red Dead Redemption 2's disturbing lore serves a purpose beyond shock value. It creates a world that feels real and consequential, where violence has weight and suffering has meaning. The serial killers, cults, and atrocities scattered throughout the map remind us that evil exists in many forms, from individual cruelty to systemic oppression. But the game also shows moments of kindness, friendship, and sacrifice that shine brighter against the darkness. In the end, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a meditation on mortality, morality, and the American myth of the frontier. It strips away romantic notions of the Old West to show the reality beneath, a society built on violence and exploitation, where survival often required compromising one's principles, and where the transition to modernity was paid for in blood and suffering. Yet even in this harsh world, the game finds space for beauty, for connection between people, and for the possibility that we can be better than our worst moments. Arthur Morgan dies, as we all must, but the game suggests that what matters is not avoiding death, which is impossible, but rather how we live and what we leave behind. Arthur's legacy, shaped by player choices, can be one of redemption and sacrifice, helping others escape the cycle of violence he couldn't break free from himself. In a world full of darkness, that small light of hope and change is perhaps the most meaningful thing the game offers.